everybody. Okay, thank you for coming. And I feel a little embarrassed at being on stage for the second time today. This is our panel with Shahzia Sikander, a great artist. And we will be discussing globalizing modernism as a theme. We're joined also, or our moderator is Eleanor Heartney, and in the interest of getting the discussion, we've decided to keep introductions as brief as possible, but I cannot forbear saying that Shahzia Sikander is, in my mind, one of the most important living artists, someone who's really changed our idea of what modern art is and should be. We'll be getting into the details in a few seconds. And I also want to say about Eleanor Heartney, one of the critics I most admire. Back in the 90s, when I was working as a critic, there were the people on the very dogmatic left theory, and then there were the people who wrote beautifully but were right-wing. And there was a voice in the middle of someone who was progressive and wrote beautifully and was smart and thoughtful, and that was you. Here's the structure for this panel. I'm going to do a very quick run-through of Sikander's work for those of you who are not already familiar with it. And then we're going to finish that with looking at an animation, a video that she did recently. And then Eleanor is going to pick up the baton and lead the discussion for a while, and then we'll go to a more open-ended conversation. So if, oh, I have the clicker. Oh, wait a second. There's two of Eleanor's recent books here, which you can buy. You should buy. They're fantastic. Okay, so Shahzia Sikander comes from Pakistan and began her career as an artist as a student at the National School of the Arts in Lahore. And what you're seeing on the right is an example of her early work. And on the left, a very important Pakistani artist of the modernist era. And this kind of modernism, not Luba Aggas that you see here, is what she was walking away from. And quite literally, from what you've told me, walking away from the studios where that was taught to the studio where miniature painting, almost a forgotten art form, was being taught. And you did something sort of brave and pioneering simply by walking in and beginning your career as a student in that form with works like the one we see on the right from 1989-90. You did mention to me recently that you were inspired in part by the work of this artist, Zahoor ul Akhlaq, who had also been looking at miniature painting, the format of the border and the image in between. Your work on the right, this is the first version of an important work, reproduces the format of the border, the image in the middle, a polo player, an important sport in Pakistan, the kind of Chinese-style rocks behind him. And then you came here to the United States and went to RISD and even broadened and deepened your work as an artist and repainted this. And I thought this was just a fascinating transformation. The new layers of imagery that have been added on, the new themes that emerge, and the reworking of this picture, Who's Veiled Anyway? And I just want to call this out as the incorporation of a kind of montage or collage technique. It's not stuck on as in classical collage, but repainted, maybe looking back to Max Ernst's Dada work of the late teens. So already you were working as a global artist, bringing together traditions from two different continents. And this then also led to works like this one, Red Riding Hood, where the imagery comes from many different places. There's different kinds of formats. There's the pure abstraction of the red polka dots, a little bit of maybe Roy Lichtenstein or Larry Poons in here. So a fantastic mixture of things. And this is the work that really made you world famous very, very rapidly. Not just this individual one, but this kind of work. And because we've skipped over introductions, I haven't talked about your MacArthur Award or your numerous shows all around the globe or the two retrospectives you already had this year in Hong Kong and Rome. But there's, it's remarkable. I do want to point out the difference to what seemed like high modernism or postmodernism, the kinds of things we were looking at in the art world at that time, the kind of pure abstractions of Gerhard Richter. Obviously, what Sikander is doing is something very, very different. And the very interesting relationship to the kind of institutional critique, postmodern, October School kind of work of, say, Barbara Kruger, who also is looking back to the tradition of montage and of political social commentary in works like this fantastic Your Body is a Battleground, but by going back to photography and a kind of abstraction, whereas your work was bringing in a richness of pictorial reference and a kind of pure, not pure, but a kind of beauty that it was not a desideratum for the critical work. I mean, it seems almost as if the art world was divided by something that was critical but very aggressive, or something that was beautiful but not terribly critical, and you were showing that it was possible to do both of those things at the same time. Maybe the breakthrough show in your career was this one in 1998 at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, where you expanded your field from the miniature to working in a mural format, many layers of imagery on the wall. These things are quite fantastic. And since then, you've carried through a series of just continuously broadening your imagery and the format of your work. So here on the left, we're looking at Usurpia from 2002, where the kind of Chinese rock formation that we saw in the center of a previous image appears in the border, and there are different kinds of cultural references. The center field has been emptied out, a reversal of your normal miniature painting priorities here. And here I want to say that your work is echoing something that's an important fact about global art, about South Asian art, which is its place in between China and the West. That, I mean, going back for hundreds and hundreds of years, that there have been cultural transmissions. The idea that every cultural tradition has existed in its own sealed silo is simply not true. There has been fantastic contact and communication. It's something that, in effect, the West forgot after 1900. And then moving forward to 2006, this is from a series of works which begin to incorporate calligraphy, of course, a very important art form in South Asia as in the Middle East, but calligraphy here with other kinds of imagery. These paintings typically are quite large, as I recall, 5-6 feet high at least, if not bigger. And then more recently, you've made a series of really extraordinary animated videos. And so now if we could please cut the PowerPoint and go, we have an excerpt from Parallax from 2012, I think? 2013, right. This was shown at the Sharjah Biennial. So at this point, if we can go back to the PowerPoint, please, and Eleanor, here's the baton. Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to step back a little bit now and go sort of to the title or the subtitle of our talk, which is Globalizing Modernism, because I want to talk about, first of all, a little bit about this sort of short history of the notion of globalism in art, and then come to where I feel that Shahzia has really given us a way to think about it that is kind of much richer and more helpful than we have had. So I'm going to go back first to 1940 and to this rather amusing little kind of diagram of the evolution of modern art by Miguel Covarrubias, a Mexican artist. The tree of modern art painted 60 years ago. So this is his take on modern art up to that point. And what I want to point out is several things. First of all, of course, we see that here's the roots of the tree, and then we have the leaves, and everything is French. And it's, it's very French or European. And also that you see down on the bottom, you have, on the one hand, of course, our connoisseur, enjoying the, evolution of modern art. On the other side, you see a African sculpture and a Greek classical bust. And so kind of the story that we're being told here is that, coming out of these two traditions, classical and African, melding them together, kind of through this sort of the mostly French evolution, you have what has become modern art. Now, surprisingly enough, this, which seems now to be a kind of very Eurocentric and narrow vision of modern art, was still prevailing 50 years later, if we can have the next one, when the Museum of Modern Art mounted a show called Primitivism, in which they wanted to look at sort of the roots of modernist art in terms of Africa. And so it really goes back in a way to that diagram. And it was a very interesting show in many ways, and part of what it had to say was very informative about the kind of way in which a lot of the modernist artists had, in fact, been deeply influenced by seeing, kind of primitive African tribal art. But it also became a very controversial show because one of the things that a lot of critics pointed out that it was a very it was a very blinkered view of the African art, that there was a kind of real double standard here between the way in which the primitive, and of course even though there were quotes around it, the primitive art and the modern art were treated, and that these, one of them was simply a kind of, as in the diagram, a feeder system into contemporary art. This show actually ignited a big discussion about what is globalism in art, and I think it was a real turning point in kind of our concepts of the narrative of modern art, leading about 5 years later to, if we can have the next slide, I think a very seminal show which took place in France, Magicians of the Earth, which was the first time that there had been an exhibition which tried to bring together artists from the West, America. They sort of well-known. It was European artists, American artists, and Japanese artists were sort of, at that point, that was what an international view of art had been. And this show was the first one to kind of bring in artists from all over the world. The curators traveled to all continents and many countries, and also wanted to avoid a lot of the pitfalls of the Primitivism show, so that instead of sort of treating the tribal, non-Western artists as sort of kind of eternal, kind of almost authorless work. They were very careful to give you the names, the dates, etc., of both the tribal or the non-Western and the Western artists. But even so, there remained, I think, a certain kind of bias, exoticism, etc., which even went to the name of the show, Magicians of the Earth, which seemed to talk about kind of this notion of you have the West, these are Western artists, in a way they were kind of much more conceptual, much more cerebral, coming again out of that tree that we saw, and then the international artists who were sort of magicians, shamans, etc. So it's still, there was a certain kind of sense of kind of exoticism of a division, even a maybe second-class citizenship. Just to tell you that this slide here is as you can, kind of typical of the show, some of the interesting juxtapositions, that you have this sand painting that was actually put together in the exhibition by a group of Aboriginal African Australian artists, and the artist Richard Long. So kind of an interesting juxtaposition, but still I think in a way maintaining that sort of notion of a kind of division maybe between these two worlds, but trying to bridge them in a way that had never been done before. Now this show, which took place in 1989, and I remember I went to the opening of this show, and while we were there, those of you who remember back, the protests were taking place in Tiananmen Square, and a month after the show opened was, of course, the Tiananmen Square massacre. But this was a moment of great change in the world at large, and which, as I hope to point out, also helped to feed into many changes that happened in the art world. So you had the Tiananmen massacre, you had just, not long after that, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the mid-90s, you had the rise of the internet. And all of these things fed into the tremendous changes that are really creating the world that we know today. The growth of global markets, the dissolution of boundaries, the end of the Cold War, all of this in what we now call or think of as the Age of Globalism. So while the world was changing, of course, the art world was changing as well. And the 90s art world struggled to kind of integrate this notion of globalism into its standard narrative and to try to figure out how do you bring in kind of these other stories. And in the end, kind of upending that whole, what had been the sort of comfortable story of the evolution of modernism that we saw in that first diagram that I showed. So modernism was replaced by globalism as kind of the new narrative or the new paradigm. And of course, if you've been attending some of the other panels here in the non-art world, globalism is a very fraught term. And it has often both positive and negative connotations in the outside world. In the art world, I think globalism, at least when it first was sort of embraced, was seen in a more kind of idealistic way as a way of expressing the crossroads of diverse cultures, a way of bringing together these diverse cultures. So it was very optimistic in a way. And the art world kind of opened itself up to globalism by beginning to bring in, as in Magicians of the Earth, all these other artists. But there were also, I think, other agendas, as there are in the larger world as well. So that you had the emergence then of these far-flung biennials all around the world. All of a sudden there were biennials everywhere. There were art fairs, and these served to open up new markets. They had other agendas. They had economic as well as artistic agendas. They helped to spur local development. I think also that the globalization of the art market, and there was a panel yesterday about the art market, one of the things it managed to do was to help to provide more liquid assets for investors. We also saw the rise of cultural tourism and cultural diplomacy, the idea that art could actually sort of serve these other kinds of agendas, that it could be an instrument for various economic, political, and social aims. So while this is all going on, and the art world and the rest of the world is sort of transforming into the age of globalism, there begins, of course, to be an awareness that there are a lot of conflicts and contradictions in the various versions of globalism that people are espousing. And never more so than in the art world. So in the art world, in the globalized art world, there began to be questions about what exactly does globalism mean? On the one hand, is it about encouraging diversity, or is it about imposing a certain homogenization that goes across all of these different countries? Is it about fetishizing the exotic? Is it a code word for the westernization of non-Western art? And is the global art market just a way to turn art into currency? So the question, these kinds of tensions that we began to feel in the art world, of course, reflected the larger tensions about globalism in the world at large. And of course, again, if you've been attending some of the other panels, some of these contradictory claims about globalism, which are the stuff of our political debates today. The question, on the one hand, the sort of pro-globalist faction talks about how globalism counters nationalism, encourages democracy, creates new opportunities. On the other side are those who talk about how globalism increases the disparity between the winners and losers and cements the privileges of various corporate elites. Okay, fast forward, post to 9/11 and beyond. now we seem to live in a moment when the kind of optimistic predictions for how globalism is going to pull the world together have been called into question. The whole notion, in a way, seems kind of endangered. So, you know, we are now asking questions about whether is it really still possible to embrace difference when the things that are happening now, the borders are being forcibly reinstated, when immigrants are being sent home to places where they may be killed or maybe never lived at all, where nationalism and calls for nationalism meld with demands for purity, and where there seems to be this rage, certainly in a certain faction of the electorate today, at the notion of identity politics and globalism. So what we want to do now, what I'd like to do now, is to sort of take this background and come back to Shahzia's work. Because I think that one of the things that Shahzia's work tells us is, you know, how is it that we can learn from art about how it means to live and flourish in multiple worlds, because I think one of the things that's very remarkable about her work is the way in which she shows us that she doesn't cement over, she doesn't resolve these tensions, but she brings them forward and makes us understand how we live in between them and with them. And what I want to do now is just a kind of quick quote from a recent interview, and then I may ask Shahzia to kind of elaborate a little bit on this in a minute. Because I think this really helps to understand kind of what it is that she's doing that's so remarkable. So she says, I am not interested in rigidity, nor am I interested in synthesis. In my collaborations, I seek dissonance that finds its own detour. Barriers and boundaries, both literal and symbolic, have the capacity to inform one's sense of belonging to or exclusion from a psychological or geographically determined space. Physical and ideological barriers break down with the creation and nurturing of dialogue. Exchanging ideas among a range of individuals and groups generates a legacy of inclusion and respect. And so I think what is to me, one of the most valuable things about Shahzia's work is the way that it encourages us to see multiple perspectives. And I'm now just going to run quickly through some of her work. Again, sort of this is as a pre-9/11 work, but was actually it was seen when it was published in what is it, Newsweek? New York Times, as you know, it was in 1999, and of course 9/11 happened soon after that. And it was sort of very prescient about looking at kind of the multiple faces of Islam, and kind of the interface really of American policy and Islamic countries. So it was a work that really kind of anticipated and you know, sort of helpful for us to sort of, even now, sort of teasing out the different aspects of Islam instead of this kind of monolith that, again, a certain part of our electorate seems to be, you know, kind of tending to think about it as. Another thing that I think is very important that her work does is to explode conventional oppositions, particularly those between cultures and genders. And here, just again, a quick look at a work which talks about the way in which you see various female images from various traditions juxtaposed. And we may ask Shahzia to talk a little bit more about that as well. Or, in another work, I'm just doing this very quickly so we can get to Shahzia. The way in which her work also brings together multiple symbol systems that underlie different forms of nationalism. So here a work, you know, in which we have these celestial beings that come from sort of traditional Persian art, and then we have also kind of references to the modern world, to the American map, but also sort of flipped. So we see, you know, it sort of becomes destabilized, and then a melding of kind of you know, modern industrialism and sort of these traditional landscapes. So again, kind of bringing together these different languages in a way that is, as she says in the quote, it doesn't synthesize, but that it allows us for these kind of dissonance that allows for a detour. Or Again, another work, this one here, bringing together this kind of motif from traditional Persian painting and the flag kind of by way of Jasper Johns. So again, these sort of different versions of history and nationalism. And then finally, and again, this might be something that a recent work that she may want to talk about, a projection that she did for the Doris Duke Foundation, in which she's talking about basically the Orientalist tendencies that have shaped not only the design of the Doris Duke estate, which is Shangri-La, which is where this took place, but really, these Orientalist tendencies that are the underpinnings, in a way, of the 20th century understanding of the other and the exotic. So, what I think, I guess what I'd like to sort of turn to now is to turn to Shahzia. You've heard a lot of us talking about her. And Shahzia, one of the things that you and I have talked about a bit is this whole question of sort of globalism, particularly kind of post 9/11, and how, that there's a kind of unraveling, in a way, of, kind of what had seemed to be this gathering synthesis, and how your work has been dealing with that.
Yes. So anyway, I just want to say hello to everybody. And I think the topic is so complex. Globalism, I have no idea how to even unpack that in context to my work. All I can say is that as an artist, when you're making work within context of time, space, period, influences, age. So all of those factors create a certain body of work, and that body of work keeps moving you along, keeps moving its interface with the community along. So that unraveling is in of itself so complex. So I think the circumstances of coming to the US in early 90s, for example, is a very interesting parallel at that time, because that's when a lot of identity politics were prevalent. So there's a lot of interest that I had, for example, we're going to come to that later too, but Eva Hesse's work. So by way of sort of an artist that's engaged with injecting a very kind of a soul into a post-minimalist system was very inspiring for me, because I wanted to see how I could engage the vocabulary of miniature painting in that same sort of thrust of coming of age, of being a young artist, of being a female artist. So it had very different connotations than taking a feminist sort of approach at that time, but more like an unraveling of understanding one's own being. So an interiority, but very aware of what it was being influenced by. So then that sort of say from that 92, 93, and we're seeing this here. Here, for example, this is sort of a homage to Doris Duke. Doris Duke, for me, was a very interesting icon of an American patronage idea, as well as a woman who's in 1930s is sort of ahead of the curve in terms of how she's collecting work. But it's also a very interesting cross-section of American Orientalism. And so it's so complex that I was less interested in looking at her collections and more interested in the exotic sort of idea of Hawaii. So the nature became more interesting to me, and I thought if I engage with the landscape, and these projections are so ephemeral. So basically what I did was I took drawings that I made and projected them into space. So wherever the drawing landed or wherever the light landed, it became a sculptural moment, it became monumental, it became ephemeral, it also became as a solution that you know, you weren't sort of like, this wasn't an exhibition ground. This is a residential area, so it's her home. And so it was more like I came up with a solution to show my work that would come up in the middle of the night. And since it's a height, it was visible by a lot of people using the water area that came for night fishing. So it just shows the malleability, the adjustability that happens because, again, it was born out of a context of being there as an artist in residence. What I want to say is that majority of my work, as you saw, the animation also, is born out of the impulse of drawing. So I think of myself as a writer, as a visual writer. For me, drawing is a mapping tool, a thinking tool. I think through it, and then it has the capacity to grow into different directions and formats. So as any individual, that you are influenced by your environment, you're influenced by what's happening. So all of that filters through the work, and some can become incredibly context-based, very specific, like the show I curated at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum looked particularly at collections that were the connoisseurs of art, how their own value system determined a subjectivity towards a certain period of collection. And then born out of that, like the work that I made was a response to that. So juxtaposition of like collections from Freer Sackler and the Americana from Cooper Hewitt, and then out of that juxtaposition, like some of the more retired relationships were reborn, or you had a new way of engaging. So that like notion of a detour.
Yes. And I wonder if you want to say a few things about the animation also, because,
I want to say that the animation that you saw actually is the hair of women. So it's that little icon, it's...
Let me move forward a couple of slides so that everyone knows what you're talking about. Here on the right is a Mughal manuscript from the 18th century of Krishna and one of the gopis, the shepherd girls who gathered around him. I hope I'm not getting the iconography wrong here. And then on the left is one of your paintings incorporating some of that imagery, so mixing a Hindu tradition and a Mughal tradition. But here is where I think we see the hair, in effect.
Yes, you can maybe move forward also.
And then we get to this figure.
All right. Well, yeah, but it definitely is dealing with the feminine space. So my interest was in unhinging it, destabilizing it. And by destabilizing, maybe mixing chronologically, not just culturally. So within the tradition of miniature painting, we're talking several decades, several centuries, and several geographical sites. So it goes all the way into icon painting, into Eastern Europe. It's not limited to a geographical site of coming from Pakistan. What I confronted was like this sort of straitjacketed into where you're from, your biography, your that this type of work must have been that you're doing because you're from Pakistan. And I think then the onus is shifted on the other. And that's like more like the 90s, the encounter, which I found then very interesting because it was basically an ability to turn the gaze around and look at other influences, which happened to be normal because I also went to an art school in Pakistan, which was set up by the English. So there is this sort of a kind of a circulatory system in place where it's already been there, like the same way that identity politics are back right now in a political domain. They were there 20 years ago too. So coming back to this idea of taking the silhouette, so I did some work where I removed the body of the female and just left the hair, the silhouette of the hair. Because I was looking for ways where you can take an image and you don't need its history anymore. You're not hiding its history, you're just dislocating it. But then with the means to create new iterations. And in that process, what I was interested with is that I make it into a particle system, and then when I multiply into millions and billions, it becomes from solid to liquid. So I'm not changing its inherent properties. It's a very rigid form. I'm just like playing with that in the animation.
Perfectly clear, those black shapes that look like fluttering birds in the video are the hair that you see here on the left, separated from the bodies, multiplied, set in motion.
Yeah, so this sort of decentering of the female was also coming from like Hélène Cixous, a French feminist linguist.
Let us move forward to some of these feminist themes. You've mentioned how important Eva Hesse was for you, and also Anna Mendieta, and I thought of the image on the right, which is a recurrent image in your work, as a response to these. Could you say more about your discovery of these artists when you got here?
Absolutely. I think, as I said again, like Eva Hesse was like a very interesting person who was involved with a kind of a language, again, pretty much male-dominated, but was also was exploring minimalism from a very kind of a tactile, personal, but the materiality of her work was very. That's exactly what I was like also unearthing. Like, how does the material itself also allows another kind of layering on top of the tradition? So, so here. What for example, this type of work that comes about is when I started to look at the typical drawing table book on Islamic art. You look at these books, they all look the same. There's a category on paintings, a category on miniatures, a category on ceramics, Quran, metalwork. And then I was like, within those categories, the objects looked imprisoned, as if they were dead. And yet, and so I was imagining how they could be injected with life, and they could basically walk out of those categories and get animated. And I think that's one way of dealing with like this rigidity of categorization. And within particularly, I think within looking at like objects within the book representation, the catalog, that category. So this is really like thinking in terms of like, it could be a multiplicity of forms, but here it's self-rooted. So it's also about a pleasing dislocation. So it's not necessarily about the diaspora. Like I'm like questioning, I'm here by choice. I'm like not necessarily always wanting to make work in response to the colonizer and the colonized. So it's also sometimes it's like that post-colonial discourse is not the only way to, you're an artist, you're going to make work out of a lot of things that you're experiencing, and that it could be from the very beginning a soaring idea, an independent idea, a soaring imagery. So a lot of this forms of this nature come, and they're also very quick gouache sketches. So they're born out of an impulsive, quick idea of like how to paint as you think.
So picking up on something you said a moment ago, you mentioned the phrase écriture féminine, which comes from the French writer Hélène Cixous, and I thought perhaps you could say a bit about her work, what her writing means to you, what uses you've made of it. I mean, these are so different seemingly from other work.
Actually, a lot of this work has never been shown. So that's why like the focus was so much on miniature painting, and there was a whole, that hijacked a lot of the narrative around the artist, around myself. Like it was very frustrating because it was always about somebody coming from somewhere else straddling a very different type of work. And that must be because that's the language of that area. And that's what I was not doing. When I started doing miniature painting, majority of the influences available were abstract expressionism. That was the prevalent language. The Euro-American canon of painting was the main language, right?
I saw the picture on the left. I thought, Jackson Pollock. And you've turned him into écriture féminine.
Well, for me, that was an interesting idea to think in terms of the multiple alterity. There was all this idea of like, oh, I'm deconstructing miniature painting. So Jacques Derrida, of course, is somebody you're understanding and reading. And plus this whole idea of the Algerian French outside identity. But I think for me, it was interesting in terms of the Jewish experience of writers and artists and poets, that kind of path into the American identity. And that's where I think it allows a way of understanding Eva Hesse's work also in terms of, I'm like interested in poetry with Slava's work, like this notion of the exile. Like I was like trying to understand that, while in the background are, Faz Ahmed Faz, a lot of like Ghalib, poets and writers, Ismat Chagtai, like again, writers and poets that may not be necessarily familiar to. So how do you puncture the proverbial East-West?
Right. Well, I think just one thing that I think it really strikes me is that you began with the miniature tradition, which was kind of an open field because it was so discredited. Then you kind of became identified with that, and it also, as you say, sometimes getting boxed into this sort of identity thing. Then moving into these other kind of media, and particularly, I'm wondering if, kind of the move into animation, installation, et cetera, is a way also for you to kind of move beyond that and to move beyond those sorts of boxes and using these other kinds of languages kind of frees you in a way to pull from
I
these.
think that's just who I am. I get bored making the same work again and again. So I think probably would be a punishing thing in the art world anyway. But I have been sort of like, interested in this kind of pursuit where I feel there's a lot of relationship to works which visually may not seem that connected, but if you dig deeper, they are very connected. And I think that is what I'm choosing, is the complexity of like where one is being influenced by, as well as what is indicative of that particular period of making that work. So this work definitely is situated in the mid-90s. And this is a time when I think it was very important for me to also explore gesture, explore mark making, and see how that could destabilize when I brought that gesture back into the very refined space of the miniature language. And I started doing that. Some of the works that you showed earlier, and when I was in the Whitney Biennial, that was the work that I had made just then, was that how almost sort of like these two layers. One is very static and stable, and then the other one is almost a removal of the labor that has already taken shape. So it's almost like a graffiti or desacred space of the very precious miniature.
So we have enough slides for another hour, but before we run out of time, I thought we should throw the floor open for questions from you guys. So if we could bring up the room lights, and please raise your hand and ask for a microphone. Sure. Yes, Tom. Or
Shahzia, I didn't know your work, and we'll look forward to finding out more about it. I find it fascinating. I'd be very interested to hear a little bit about what response it has provoked in the Middle East, and whether you've had to self-censor in the materials that you're kind of being inspired by, especially the religious imagery.
Well, I think the work in the 90s signaled back the success of miniature painting. And so there's been a lot of people doing miniature painting within Pakistan. So when I started in 1980s, late 80s, there was very little interest in the actual art form. So 2 decades later, it's called the new miniature. So that whole interest in a particular language of work that can be exported as the Pakistani contemporary identity is in of itself another topic to debate, because the complexity of that is there, right?
We're already talking about doing a panel on
But
this
so,
somewhere.
of course, so in that respect, there's been a lot of like influence. But I think in terms of a idea of censorship, in terms of how an artist is perceived, I would say in 20 years ago, I was often being used as somebody who is getting interested in the West because of the nature of the work, that the work is very exotic. And then 20 years later, in current, this is the work that is being seen, the miniature painting work is being seen as work coming out of the local production of Pakistan, which so both are very extreme positions. In terms of like kind of a problem with the nature of the work, I remember once in post-September 11th, I was doing some work at a law firm. It was like a site-specific work, and they objected to the work that you shared earlier, the fleshy weapons. So censorship I have experienced was here. In that respect, there was objection to that imagery, and I was asked to remove that work. So I actually I took all my work out of that commission project. So it varies. It varies. It varies on what this context is. But for example, this particular image is the idea of multiplicity from within the India-Pakistan divide. So the split of who owns what, where is ownership.
Well, this looks kind of like Kale. I mean, I imagine the law firm was worrying about,
It's also about the androgynous space of the female. It's not necessarily just about the weapons. It's a very appropriated image from the multiplicity that the deity had. And it's, for me, what I'm doing is that I was interested in the space of the young child and the female, and the sort of like dislocation when that dislocation occurs in terms of the vulnerability. But at the same time, it's a self-rooted image, the idea of the female form being self-rooted. And then Kali's got the whole reference with male and female. So it plays on sexuality from multiple perspectives.
At a more pragmatic level, thinking about Tom's question, I mean, Parallax was commissioned, I think, for the Sharjah Biennial, and you've had multiple shows in the Middle East, so you haven't been blocked out of that.
No, I haven't been blocked out. I think, like, for example, Sharjah is on the Strait of Hormuz and its maritime history, which is a very contested history given the myth of the whole notion of piracy, and then the multiple colonial influences. And the idea of trade is very interesting when you start to bring in the East India Company. And the East India Company, for me, is very interesting because that is also the English history that, the schooling that, like the Lahore, the National College of Art, was Kipling was the president of that school initially. So in terms of like the colonial history of Pakistan, what I find very interesting with, say, as a parallel to Middle East is, and then as a parallel to the Caribbean, is the Creole, the idea of the Creole, the multiplicity, because plurality has been always present. It's nothing something new. It's there. It's been there. It's the ability to like to sieve through it and then determine the details, which I think gets
and to create those dissonances.
Yeah, that gets missed.
One more.
Another question? Well, let me add a comment, and then if we have time, I wanted to go back. Actually, never mind the comment. Let us go back then to Shirin Neshat, who you've mentioned as someone who is also important to you, along with Mendieta and Hesse. And this seems to pick up on the theme of women and violence and so forth. This is very early Neshat, before Rapture and the other videos that she's most famous for. When did you discover her work? What did it mean to you?
Well, I met Shirin in the early 90s when I moved to New York. So it's also born out of like, a time when your relationships with the other artists are being formed and how you're overlapping. So her work for me is very different. Her work comes out of a very specific engagement with the image of Iran, from the political dimensions of Iran. It's the same thing that we were talking earlier, this categorization of this, the idea of the Muslim, the idea of the Islamic. It's so diverse. You can't box it into one space. So growing up in Pakistan, I had very little engagement with Iran culture. It wasn't really, you couldn't really travel, you couldn't drive there. So it's a very separate history also. And, but when exhibitions that would put artists that happen to be from various Islamic countries into one exhibition, it's a very questionable and complex and complicated. These are interesting exhibitions. It's how they get unpacked, which is more important. So in terms of a juxtaposition with Shirin's work, it's very interesting. It depends on how we're going to unpack it, right? If we're trying to find similarities, or we're really going to understand in depth where the works are coming from. Hers are coming from her interest in film and photography, and mine's really coming from a materiality of painting.
I think this is the point with your work, is the similarities and differences and being specific about them instead of these kind of general, the art world likes to put these general categories. And your work is so...
It's always about defining those categories,
yes,
or trying to find sort of an interface that allows multiplicity of meaning.
Exactly.
I'm sorry to say that we have run out of time, so we're going to have to stop here with defining categories, which is a very good summary.
Or redefining
Or redefining categories. Thank you, everybody, for coming.